There are very few people in East Timor who didn't lose a loved one in their two-decade fight for independence. So this ceremony, reburying the bones of the war dead at the National Martyrs Cemetery, was filled with grief. But it was also a day of pride, the 10-year anniversary of Timor's success in that push for independence from Indonesia, the neighboring country that had violently swallowed it whole in the 1970s after Portugal abandoned its longtime colony. Flanked by dignitaries from around the world stood Xanana Gusmao. Once a resistance fighter, he is now East Timor's prime minister. And José Ramos Horta, who lived for years in exile, lobbying for freedom for his country. Today, he is the president.
I have enjoyed it thoroughly, to be reattached culturally, physically, to part of my body and spirit, in spite of the difficulties we encountered in these last 10 years.
Timor-Leste.
Difficulties of the past 10 years, because Ramos Horta, Gusmao, and their Timorese citizens have had to build their new country from the ground up. More than 100,000 people had died during the 24-year occupation, and when Indonesian troops finally withdrew in a spasm of violence, East Timor was left in ruins. Even today, its fragility remains obvious. Half its people live below the poverty line. Burned buildings remain on many corners. Unemployment runs as high as 40%. But overcoming adversity is not new to Timorese like Eduardo Bello Suarez, a former guerrilla fighter now making the transition to ordinary citizen.
For me, I myself, I have obligation. And I believe that everyone has obligation to feel the independence of this country.
For Bello, that obligation meant starting a business and creating jobs. So he took a small grant given to him by the United Nations and made an investment.
My business, or my carpentry, started from this wood lathe.
This is the very first thing you bought?
This is the very first thing I had.
In a place that has so little, even tables and chairs are important. Over 6,000 of Bello's desks are now in Timor's schools and government offices, and Bello now employs more than 600 Timorese. But even an army of Bellos is not enough to build a nation. From the beginning, that job has also fallen to the international community, backed today by 1,600 United Nations police and 800 peacekeeping troops from Australia and New Zealand. Although East Timor is only the size of Connecticut with a population of 1 million, the international community's job here has been one of its biggest ever undertaken.
This has been, to some extent, a laboratory for the international community, and continues to be.
Edward Rees first came to East Timor in 2000 with the UN mission. Today, he runs an international development group here.
This was probably the first place where the international community played a direct and highly intrusive and controlling role in the Ministry of Finance and the business of tax collection and revenue generation and natural resources management. And this was the first place that the United Nations played a role in the creation of a national defense force.
While the UN provided crucial emergency services to those displaced from the fighting and oversaw successful elections, it had never before tried to build the institutions needed to run a country, and was given very little time to do it.
The United Nations was here for 2 years. In 2 years, with the best of intentions, all the resources they could have mastered, and they did have a lot of resources, financial and human resources, they could not have built up a modern, functioning state within 2 years.
I think given the time that they had, they made expedited decisions in order to get things done, to keep to the schedule that New York had given them, and they were the wrong decisions for the long-term stability of the country.
Rees and other international analysts point to the mismanaged building of a professional military and police force, and a failure to properly integrate former guerrilla fighters, leaving them marginalized and disgruntled. Just as the UN was in its final stages of drawdown in 2006, political infighting tore apart these fragile institutions. Ian Martin is with the UN.
What happened then was an implosion in the security sector, in both the army and also in the police, who ended up fighting each other and with major divisions inside each of those institutions. And the state itself, in many ways, collapsed.
Violence cascaded into the streets. Dozens were killed and thousands again displaced. East Timor called for help. The international community sent new peacekeeping troops and scaled the UN back up. UN officials admit lessons were learned, that nation building takes time.
Many people looking back feel that the disengagement of the international community in some ways came too quickly. So the first lesson, I think, is start with realistic expectations as to what a long business nation building or state building actually is.
Louise Arbour, president of the International Crisis Group, agrees there was pressure to leave from all sides.
In the case of Timor-Leste, what you had, I think, on the one hand, is a great appetite for those who were constructing their country to be free as soon as possible to take over that responsibility. And at the same time, I think a Security Council, a UN, not particularly anxious to stay any longer than was absolutely necessary. So you had a mix there that I think probably encouraged an exit that in retrospect was probably premature.
Now that the international community is back, there is more focus on shoring up the police and military. Under the watchful eye of Australian peacekeepers, Timor's army and police recently squared off in a friendly shooting competition. Just 3 years ago, they were killing each other. Police Commander Longinus Montero is hopeful a corner has been turned. Why are exercises like this important for your forces?
This is one of the proof that we can show everybody that we are working as a part of the state institutions. We are working side by side. We are sharing our ideas. We have to leave all the past gone away. This is what East Timor needs, because our people is suffering too much.
It's uncertain if this camaraderie will hold. According to an International Crisis Group report, the Timorese government has resisted further reforms, such as instituting civilian control and defining the specific tasks of the army and police. Edward Rees says the UN is still struggling to figure out its role.
The United Nations police, which are the largest link in the chain, are also the weakest link in the chain. Police officers are not institution builders. Their job is to train people how to be police officers. Their job is not to teach people how to run a police service, particularly when it comes to the civilian oversight and management of legislative issues, personnel issues, logistics issues, financial issues, budgeting, planning.
The UN may be having better luck building East Timor's political institutions, including a 65-member parliament. Just a courtyard away from the impressive main chamber, a UN program is teaching staff everything from drafting legislation to scheduling a minister's daybook.
So you will help with the speeches, yeah?
UN staffer Tony Sisule came from Kenya to help.
Working with my colleague Jonas, he's fresh from university, and that's probably the best you're going to get, a fresh graduate. He doesn't have work experience. I bring 10 years or so of work experience from many other countries. So we basically try to transfer this experience to the young Timorese who are coming up. 2-3 years down the road, I think they should be able to handle a lot of the functions on their own.
Today, the capital Dili is becoming a bit of a boom town. Building construction is everywhere. There's a new slogan here: goodbye conflict, hello development. A well-attended exposition promises a comfort never before imagined. Much of this is because the country got lucky. It struck oil in the Timor Sea. Just after the crisis of 2006 hit, oil revenues began to flow, a boon for the struggling government.
Their chosen way of dealing with problems is handing out dollars.
Charles Shiner is a longtime activist who now works for a well-respected local watchdog group. He says East Timor has a habit of using its oil wealth to literally pay off disgruntled members of society, from dismissed army soldiers to displaced people.
So it sort of resolved the problems, the instant problems, but it created a pattern where people say, we don't get services from the government unless we make trouble. If we make trouble, we get money. If we just sit quietly and are good citizens and wait for the government to provide education or health care or roads or water, it's not going to happen. I think right now things are pretty peaceful, and we're lucky maybe, but I think that the elements of further conflict are still there.
Peace has to be paid for. Peace has to be bought, whether in Timor or anywhere in the world. And when we say it has to be paid for, it's not in the sense you buy people. In the sense you have to invest in creating infrastructures that create jobs. You have to hand out, when necessary, cash for the poorest.
And this is East Timor's big gamble. With a petroleum fund now worth more than $5 billion, the government is spending more of the money on short-term problems rather than saving it for the future. Besides the cash handouts, the government is spending millions importing a basic food staple, rice, in effect buying some calm and some time for the country's more long-term development goals.
I think if you're me, that's the wrong policy. I think if you're Timorese, it's the right policy. I think that they have made a calculated decision that we need to distance the community from the last event as far as possible. And so spending the money today in order to ensure that nothing happens in the next 5-10 years, as I'm sure that's the way they are thinking, strikes me as being sensible.
It's a fragile political equation, one that might still unravel under societal pressures. Chief among them, what to do with all the young unemployed people, a demographic that has become violent in the past. Here in the mountain town of Aleu, a U.S. government-funded program seeks to counter these risks by offering general classroom education and specific skills training to otherwise idle youth. This particular session only had slots for 50 students. Twice that many had applied. Anna Berry Martins is the program's chief trainer. Do you worry about the security of your country if there isn't more work like this to engage the young people, to train them, to get them jobs?
Before there were programs like this, violence among the youth was very high. But when they started participating in this program, they began to understand how to minimize the violence. If there is no opportunity like this, then we might have new problems.
We've historically looked at security in a very kind of traditional and maybe too narrow focus, a very sort of military approach to security. But it seems to me that what we need to look at, it's very ambitious, but I think we're there, is look at other indicators of real human security. You know, are girls returning to school? Are women safe in their communities? Is civil society occupying some space?
Another potential pressure point. East Timor has not pursued war crimes tribunals against Indonesia, calculating that it needs to keep the peace with its much larger neighbor.
Let's put the past behind. There will be no international tribunal. The greatest gift for me, greatest gift for us, is that we are free today. Those who committed crimes in the past, they are the ones who have to look themselves in the mirror and be ashamed and be haunted by the crimes they committed, not me. So this country must have the courage to move on.
But there are concerns that many Timorese may not have the same capacity to forgive and move on as President Ramos Horta. Seo Lopez is a Timorese activist recently recognized for her contribution to society. But she disagrees strongly with her president on the issue of justice.
It's about right and wrong, more than hanging generals and send them to jails. But we must establish that certain behavior are not tolerated anywhere in the world. Why should it be tolerated in East Timor?
For Lopez, this is one of the greatest risks facing East Timor today.
These people are so angry, they accumulate and accumulate. When there is an opportunity for all the closets to be open, because someone put a flame somewhere, it takes seconds, because it's just underneath the first skin of the surface. And this is still a very high risk.
As the flag was raised at East Timor's commemorations of its bold first steps 10 years ago, many open questions remain for its future. At stake is not just peace and prosperity for one of the world's newest nations, but also the role of the international community as it continues to grapple with the task of nation building.